The White House is looking at declaring a national economic emergency, according to a US Treasury official. This would provide the US government with special powers to clamp down on Chinese investments in certain industries such as semiconductors and robotics, where the US is worried about strategic targeting by Beijing. Joining me now to discuss his views on the trade war tensions is Chris Watling, CEO and Chief Market Strategist at Longview Economics. Chris, thanks so much for coming in. So it seems as though there's a few different issues going on that get sort of mixed up. And the first one is the US trade deficit. And then the second one is the threat from China immediately in terms of trade. And then there's the broader threat from China as it grows and grows and threatens the US's role as a global superpower. So I wanted to start with the trade deficit. Do you think that these tariffs that the US president is imposing is the right way to go about tackling this deficit?
No, I don't. I don't think tariffs is the right solution. I think, and economists are very clear, tariffs don't help global growth. And they're unlikely to solve the deficit problem. In fact, if you look at the deficit, I think the administration misunderstands this. They see it as a supply side issue with sort of China stealing growth from the States and so on because of their unfair trade practices, etc. But actually what the deficit is really about, in my opinion, is about US overconsumption, which is the same thing as a lack of saving. And it's all sort of teed up by a financial system in the States that has this huge ability to create a lot of credit. And with that credit comes overconsumption, and with overconsumption comes a deficit, basically.
So what I'm hearing is that the deficit isn't really anything to do with China at all. It's actually a domestic issue. What should Mr. Trump be trying to do to actually tackle this deficit?
To tackle that deficit, you need to get America off its binging on debt, basically. You need to encourage more of a savings culture. You need to encourage more of an investment culture and more of a sort of productivity growth, supply-side driven economy, rather than an economy that's very dependent on consumption, retail sales and all this sort of stuff that we know about.
There have been a lot of positives related to the US deficit, though. The US has been able to enjoy very cheap exports from China and elsewhere around the world. I'm wondering whether this deficit even matters.
I think in the short term it doesn't really matter, but where perhaps Trump has a point is over the last 15 years China has been keeping its currency artificially low. You wouldn't say that today. I think Chinese currency is probably a little bit expensive today, but over the long term they've been keeping it artificially low, and I think that's contributed to more of a deficit in the States than otherwise might be the case. So there are some things at work that contribute to that, but primarily I think it's this overconsumption story.
Now, in terms of trade with China, it's clear that things aren't exactly fair and reciprocal. China has full access to US markets where it isn't the same the other way around. Allegedly, China steals some intellectual property secrets. There are reasons here for Trump to be worried. Do you think he has a fair point when he's trying to level the playing field, and do you think his pressure will work?
I definitely think he has a fair point. It's undoubtedly the case that there's theft of intellectual property. US companies, when they sell into China and base themselves in China, are obligated to bring their R&D base with them. And we've had a lot of American CEOs confirm this. Jamie Dimon, not 2 weeks ago, confirming that, yes, there was theft of intellectual property. So, of course, this is an issue, and this is an unlevel playing field that needs to be leveled. Whether or not Trump's going to be successful is hard to say. I mean, he's following his normal playbook, the art of the deal. Go in hard, or shock and awe, and then see what you can get and roll it back a little bit. So I'm sure he'll get something. He seems quite determined to get something. He doesn't like losing. So I'm sure something will come on the table. Whether or not it's everything he really wants, who knows?
And how do currencies play into this? Because it's been argued that the yuan could be used as a type of trade war tool. Do you see that playing out?
Well, it's always possible, but I think it's unlikely because a sharp depreciation of the yuan, the renminbi, would lead to more imported inflation in China. And of course, most of that comes in food prices as well as other commodity prices. And that leads to social unrest as people's food gets more expensive. So I wouldn't have thought that's an obvious playbook for the Chinese to follow. But it's possible. I mean, but in the last few weeks and months, they've been strengthening their currency. So they're clearly not thinking along those lines at the moment.
And how do you see the trade war playing out? Do you see it really ramping up and it getting worse and worse? Or is it in both parties' interest to really come to some kind of an arrangement?
Well, I think what we'll do is, as I say, we'll have Trump's classic playbook. And I think in China's mind and interest, really, they want to just, they don't want to force an escalation. They want to give as little as they can to appease Trump and to move the debate on, I think.
Now, America is clearly very concerned about its relative economic decline versus China. How do you see this kind of playing out? Do you think that Trump is ultimately fighting a losing battle? I know that you've been looking at the Thucydides trap, so perhaps you could talk more about that and other examples in history.
Yeah, so I think there is some logic behind Trump's tariffs, and the logic comes from history. And I think this isn't properly appreciated. The Thucydides trap, put forward by Professor Allison, hard to say, I know, is an example of when a rising power challenges a great power. And Professor Allison looks throughout history and he shows that 16 examples he finds, 12 of them end up in a major war. And I think if you take that, and by the way, it's important to mention that Professor Allison spent a lot of time in the White House. He's been talking to the Steve Bannon of old, but Mattis and a lot of these guys buy this theory, Pompeo, and they've, it's part of the Trump philosophy. They need to push back on China, fronting up to China. And if you sort of mingle that theory from Professor Allison with what we see from Paul Kennedy, Professor Kennedy, in the 80s, when he talks about the rise and fall of great powers. He talks about economies keeping their relative economic strength. This is key. If you want to stay top dog, your economy's got to stay top dog. And with that, your technology's got to stay ahead of the pack. So this, I think, is where tariffs and intellectual property come into play. Because if the US loses the technological leadership to China, whether because China creates the innovation themselves or whether because they steal it, then the US, I think, is on a much more rapid path to losing global economic top dog status.
So is there a bit of confusion within Trump's overall strategy? Because on the one hand, he's thinking America first, very protectionist. On the other hand, he doesn't want to lose that position as the top global superpower to China. And if he doesn't want to do that, he's got to play the global game.
That's right. I think there's an inconsistency in the strategy. So, yes, as you say, on the one hand, he wants to front up to China to stay top economic dog. But on the other hand, he wants to be fairly isolationist. And we see him trying to withdraw from the Middle East, for example, trying to get Europe to pay for much more of NATO, all these sort of things. And I think there's an inconsistency there, because if you want to run the global economy, you need to be engaged in the global economy across all bases. And that's where it makes me slightly nervous. I can see the logic of challenging China on intellectual property rights, but I can't see the consistency across the administration's strategy.
Okay, Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Chris Watling, CEO and Chief Market Strategist at Longview Economics. I'm Victoria Scholar. Thanks so much for watching IGTV, and we'll see you very soon.